Just want to welcome everybody today to our after survey action that is focused on performance management. Our hope today is that we can really focus in on the culture of feedback and some small steps that you can take to ultimately, hopefully, produce a large scale impact that are not just about kind of formal performance review processes. I am delighted to be joined today here with my former colleague, Beth Napleton, who has been a member of our leading edge consultant team this year, so has been kind of deep with all of you in the survey data and has spent a lot of time, I'll let her introduce herself fully, but as a former educator who thought a lot about improving performance over time in classrooms and in other spaces as well. So just a quick logistical note, y'all, we'll keep an eye on the chat, certainly. We are recording this and we'll be sending the slides following. So we hope you'll be with us, for our full session today, but wanted folks to know that they'll be able to have access to the recording and to the session deck. And just a note too, we know there is just so much heaviness in the world at this moment. We are delighted that you have taken some time to focus on something hopefully that feels for you as you show up for other people. We also recognize this might not be what you need in the moment. So please feel free, again, if you need to drop off the call, we understand that, and we'll make sure folks have the resources following the call. And with that, Beth, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dana. It's so nice to be here. Thank you all so much. And I see the chat just popping up and flying by, seeing some familiar names, which is exciting, and also some new ones. And of course, lots of good ideas like getting lunch and fresh flowers. And these are all these things. So I'll tell you a little bit more about myself in a minute, but I am in Brooklyn right now, and I am grateful for coffee, which I'm grateful for every day, but it seems like the later in the week it gets, the more and more it rises to the top of these lists. So I'm definitely feeling that today. So I appreciate those introductions. So yeah, we will go ahead and get started and talk about this performance management, small steps with big impact. I'm going to ask that if you have questions as you throughout, you can use the Q&A box, which is, I think, in that Zoom little dashboard piece. And I'll have some time where I'll look specifically to that and make sure I'm answering any questions. Definitely keep an eye on the chat, but sometimes it goes so fast. We'll be using it a lot, which is helpful, but it can be easy to miss things in there. And if you put your questions in the Q&A box, I am less likely to miss it. So today we're going to be really talking about kind of performance management as like an ecosystem, right? And this kind of holistic idea of performance management beyond the formal review process. And we're going to talk about some case studies where leaders were able to impact performance and improve the performance of their team. And then think about some kind of sample steps that can lead to that, because there are some really small steps that can start this off. So while we start and you're getting warmed up, let me find my little Zoom control board situation here. And I'm going to launch a poll to get your thoughts and kind of try and read the room, so to speak, in this world, as to what you think about, how you feel, and where your organization is when it comes to performance management. So I'll go ahead and leave that up for a minute. I will sip my last coffee of the day. Yesterday's was a little later and I was up far too late last night. Therefore, it's a vicious cycle, but would love to get your thoughts. I see folks entering. Ooh, these numbers are just popping up in the poll. It's helpful to kind of get a sense of where you are, kind of how, you're positioning towards us, kind of thinking about this as we go through. So I love this. Folks from all over North America, it looks like, which is very exciting. Okay. All right. So we're at 84% survey participation. I'll leave it for just a minute, and then we'll summarize. And then I'll tell you a little bit about myself, maybe while I leave it open, and we will go from there. So I am Beth Napleton. Dana and I worked together in a former life. I've been in education and now again too, so current life, so very lucky. I've been mostly in education and in mission-driven nonprofits for 25 plus years, including founding a school and a small charter network and running a Teach for America training institute. I really focus a lot. I've been in business for myself for about 3 years, and I do coaching and consulting, and I focus a lot on kind of the culture and performance work, right? And kind of helping to think about an organization's mission and how do you get kind of the people in a good place to supercharge the mission, and so that people are, happy at work and feeling satisfied and growing, and people are thriving, especially as the world is, perhaps literally falling apart around us. There's some comfort in where I go to work and where I spend my time is there. I've been a leading edge coach for I think just over a full year, and doing the employee engagement survey, which has been a delight as well. And we'll talk about the survey today and kind of how this connects to it. And I am a mom of 3 kids. So I work with clients from all over. You can see it's a great, usually via my favorite medium, Zoom, although sometimes certainly here at home in New York City. And I'll end the poll now. We've got 100% participation. So everybody gets like a pat on the back, as my kindergarten teacher would say. And I'll leave this slide up, and it looks like we are pretty evenly split. When I think about performance management, there's a slight edge, 32% intrigued, but a little resistant, but then it's really pretty evenly split. 26% are excited, 21% get a headache, another 21% listen cautiously, right? So I think we're all over the map, which makes sense. And I think it probably depends on where you are in your organization and kind of all these different pieces, but it is really complex. And so I think that, and there's lots of humanity that's in that, and that always is tricky. And so whenever we get humans involved, it complicates things. And it looks like really most folks, 58% are squarely, I guess I can share the results and see if that comes across. 58% are squarely in this okay, but could be better space. And it looks like another 26% are kind of like, ugh, and about 16% are feeling good about it. No one's quite at amazing. And I think that makes sense. So we'll see. This is really helpful to know and think about. And obviously folks are coming in from all different places. And so please, I want you to get the most out of this. I know your time is one of the most valuable resources you have. And so I really try and maximize and make this as engaging as learning as possible. So first, we're going to learn about performance management just for a small second from one of my all-time favorites, Bruce Springsteen. And you might be thinking, have I wandered into the wrong masterclass here? What is happening? And so I really, in true seriousness, I do take a lot of leadership lessons from Bruce Springsteen. And I'm, got hooked on him in 2007, which is late for a super fan. But when I went to my first concert in 2007, I had just recently started working at a school that was really struggling. I was having a lot of professional challenges. I had 40 kids in a class. I had a principal who wasn't listening to any of my suggestions at the time. And I was able to go see this concert and see this band working together. And of course, the music was great, but seeing the band work together, it just hit me so clearly that there was a lot to learn about how amazing teams work together. And obviously, Bruce Springsteen he's sold over 150 million records, right? He's had 12 #1 hits. He's grossed $1.5 billion in revenue, is like a total treasure. So any Springsteen fans, feel free I could really go off in this, but I'll try and corral it. But I do think that there is something with Bruce and really with any fans, right? Any teams, which is like teams are part of our secret weapon. And, Bruce always talks at his concerts and his Broadway show about this idea of like 1 + 1 = 3, right? What does he mean by this? And I think that it's, really this idea of when all the individuals come together, it adds up to something greater than the sum of its parts. So it's really incredible. And when you think about performance management, you think about teams, you've got individuals, and it's a real art because you're trying to make sure the individuals are like really strong musicians in their own right. And you're also trying to make sure that they play well together, right? If I have like a great rock and roll drummer and then like a violinist who's playing classical music, it does not sound good together. And they might be great in their own right, but how do we make great music as an organization with all our individual parts adding up together? And I think that's one of the reasons why it can be incredibly complex. And teams can do things together and that you can't do as individuals, right? You need different functionalities, different expertise. You need the finance people, the back end, the program people. And so really there's a lot you can always do as a solo musician, but there's so much more that you can do as a team. So when I work with leaders, I think a lot about the teams that you're leading and how each of these artists are incredible on their own. But when you put them together, it does equal something greater than the sum of its parts. And look, this is true for Bruce Springsteen. It's also true for sports teams. It's true for, I have the Obama administration cabinet here, right? And like whether you're winning the NBA trophy or trying to run a country in a time of peace and prosperity or making great music, there's something that happens when groups of people come together and do more than the sum of its parts. And so where this gets to perform, and really in some ways, it is about zooming out and thinking about this idea of performance management, right? And so like, what does performance management look like for Bruce Springsteen? We're going to put on an awesome concert that really engages people across the board, right? What does performance management look like at your organization? Well, that might depend. Are you leading a JCC? Are you working are you leading a school? Are you running a camp, right? There's like lots of different, like what great performance look like is going to vary. And I think what's complicated is there are so many pieces that go into making sure, just like the musicians have to make sure their instruments are tuned and they're there for practice and they know those pieces and they can communicate silently with each other on stage. We think about, in order for our school to reach our mission, if we're using a school as an example, do people feel psychologically safe? Do we have clear goals? Are we growing enough to feel challenged, but not too much that we feel overwhelmed, right? When I talk about what, a great classroom is, do we all have the same definition of what that means? Are people open to feedback? Are leaders open to feedback? So there's like a lot that comes in and you can start to get a bit of a headache. And so I think that's where that can be in. So we're going to really focus today. I think essentially what performance management gets to is kind of this idea, which is how do I make sure that people are meeting and exceeding expectations, aiming their skills and talents at your challenges to reach your goals and missions, right? So it's really like, this is what you're trying to do, right? Whether you're talking about the basketball championship or the music or the, goals in your strategic plan. There's an element of thinking about people, right? And it's helpful to think about individuals and teams kind of side by side here. There's an element of meeting or exceeding expectations, right? Which there's a lot packed into this as well. There's this element of skills and talents, right? And kind of what people do best and where they thrive and where they're in flow. And then there's this piece of goals, right? And so much of this connects to the employee engagement survey, which I believe you all should be familiar with. This is the training data, but kind of thinking about this idea of employee engagement, this idea of being successful at work. And I think we're going to talk today about so many of the different, so many of these questions that are not about performance management in a formal sense, but that do help feed into this ecosystem that help you thrive. Do you get feedback from your manager that's good for your growth? Are you comfortable giving feedback to your colleagues, right? Are you clear on what you're expected to do and by when? Do you have opportunities to do challenge and interesting work? And it's not only performance management that feeds into some of these pieces, but I do think that this is all kind of in this realm of the performance management ecosystem. So I've been talking a lot. I'm going to stop talking as much and we're going to do some case studies. And I'm trying this way of doing it and we're going to see how it works. And I was a teacher for many years, so I can absolutely cold call on people and have you volunteer. But we're going to really look at some scenarios from real clients that I've worked with and think about what is the role of performance management in this. And so we'll look at an example. I'll read it through. I'll give you a chance to read it. We'll have some time to think in the chat about like, what does this make you think about when you think about this ecosystem of performance management? And then we'll talk a little bit about it. And also I'll share a little bit about like what I did that kind of helped with performance. And so hopefully this is an interesting example. We'll see how this goes. So I'm going to read this only because I know sometimes when I'm on Zoom and my camera's off, I'm like, over there doing this, I'm there. So if you are reading and learn best that way, by all means. But a homeless shelter for women and children has had tremendous growth in the past 10 years, serving more families, opening new locations, and ensuring families break the cycle of homelessness. The CEO came in when they had a $500,000 budget. Now it's almost 10 million. So tons of growth in a very short time. The board stopped meeting regularly during the pandemic and worked in a more ad hoc way. CEO oversight was minimal. And 6 months ago, they realized a significant 7-figure grant had been spent down and nobody really knew where it went. So one of the reasons that kind of we came in. So there's a lot in here, even in this short synthesized example. So what I would love is I will put like 2 minutes on the timer. And I would love for you to write in the chat, what is this making you think about with performance management? It might be questions that come to mind. It might be wonderings. It might be noticings. But in this ecosystem of helping this organization perform, and this is an example that I work with the board. There's lots of parallels on the staff side here. But let's just kind of brainstorm here and talk a little bit about what performance issues, management issues are at play here. So I'll put 2 minutes on. And just let you put some thoughts in the chat. Oops, sorry. I see some really good thoughts coming in. Okay. And that is about 2 minutes, and there is a lot in here. So I want to start, and I sometimes do the Zoom raise your hand thing, and sometimes I just have people come off mute, and I feel like we're kind of a mid-sized group, so maybe either can work. So I think that I would love to have some folks kind of come off mute and just think about like and I see lots of great questions in here. I could probably talk about this for the next hour, as is the case with each case study. So we'll stay away from some of the questions because that'll lead us down a rabbit hole there. But you can also, I guess like in terms of me answering the questions, but like these are questions. It makes me think about expectations. It makes me think about communication, et cetera. But folks want to come off mute and share like what really popped out to you here. And I'll go through the chat, and I'm going to call on some people if I don't get volunteers. So I'll give people 30 seconds or so to come off, but let's have just a little bit of discussion.
I'll go. Hello, everyone. My name is Isaiah Connor. I am the new Human Resources Director here at Eldovich Jewish Community Center of DC. My thoughts on this is that they had a position that they were trying to, establish, and they were trying to, gain profitability in different areas to help them with their establishment and their processes. And when they finally got that, they ran with it without thinking about what they need to do to keep the momentum going, what can happen, far as the security measures and, people coming in and not being able to properly oversee that massive money that they had. It's almost like you got all of this money, but where's the protection and insurance behind it, and making sure that people are not able to easily assess that money and someone is able to properly manage that. And while the CEO came in and he was able to bring about great production financially, where's the overseeing of that? Did you think about that while you were trying to implement ways of raising more money? I think that was the biggest mistake there, is just not having any safety and security precautions and insurance behind those that increase.
Right. Thank you, Isaiah. I mean, and look, policy and systems can get a bad rap, right? Mm-hmm. And Sarah, I'm going to call on you next. I saw your hand raised, but they exist for a reason. and it's a pendulum. There can definitely be such a thing as too many, and there can be definitely such a thing as too little. And I think too little is fair. Sarah, go ahead.
First of all, I was surprised that during COVID there was less oversight, when I don't know others, but that was a time where we needed more oversight, and I kind of had to like have my board take a bit of a backseat a little bit after we got out of the heaviness of COVID. But this is very much like, we had a situation here prior to my being an ED where this was very much the case, where as long as there was money coming in, there was like kind of hands off, like that was the performance management tool. And so if money came in, then we'll just leave you to do it. And so I think that's a trap that we all fall into, whatever, like having a performance management that's based on one element. And then the other piece is just that we tend to use performance management as when there's a problem, and then we're using it kind of as a performance improvement plan, as opposed to creating benchmarks and consistencies, and how can we be looking at, the goals of the organization and stuff. And so if we do it just based on that, then I think we miss a lot. And I feel like that's where this case study, that's why it happened like this. And So yeah, so really like the consistency of performance management, and then a number of things that you're evaluating on, not just a singularity.
Yeah. I mean, because one thing can really mask, right? And it can go in both directions, but okay, it's good. It's good. And the reality is, if they had brought me in a year ago, before this, they like kind of discovered like, where did this go? The same problems would have existed, right? I mean, a lot of people wrote in the chat about kind of, there obviously is a big organization. Where's the team? What's the support? What's the accountability look like there? I focused a lot on this board ED level, but there's a whole level below that, which like, one of my favorite kind of obscure sayings is like, the fish stinks from the head. Like, you really have to kind of look at the top, and it goes through the organization. It would be very rare if there was like great communication and accountability at the ground level, and less as you go up, right? Maybe, but it does tend, you can really set a tone. And so I think there's that element there. So this is really helpful. We're gonna,
And I also think that sometimes we or just organizations can be so stuck on the performance piece of it, but don't think of the management piece of it. While you have to worry and focus on, adequate performance, you also have to have something in place in terms of managing that along the way. And that could have been a mistake here too.
Absolutely. And I saw a lot in the chat about regular check-ins, communication. When communication disappears, right, bad things happen. And so I think that one of the things that is interesting is that like, you very much like, this is also a board that like didn't have a formal review of the CEO for many years. And so I think the formal systems can be important, and they're a canary in the mine, but ultimately what this really got to, and one of the things, I have a tiny URL at the end, we'll have a bunch of resources and kind of thinking about where we really went to after doing like a pretty comprehensive analysis and trying to figure things out, was like, what are expectations? Like, what are the expectations for the CEO? What are the expectations for the board? Who's the decision maker on various topics? What's an appropriate level of oversight and accountability? I think the CEO had kind of, was, I think the generous interpretation is that she was burned out, and she kind of was like, enough with all these meetings. I'm just going to do my thing over here. But then they were neglecting their fiduciary responsibilities. And all of a sudden they're in a big hole and have some big cash flow problems. And they're thinking, oh my gosh, we didn't do this. And so it really was about a reset, right? And thinking about resetting expectations and thinking about, this piece. And it probably doesn't surprise you to know that when I went into the site visit and I did a bunch of focus groups and I interviewed people, do you think that people were having check-ins up and down the organization? They were not. They were not, right? Exactly. And so, these are things that now it's like, okay, let's start to focus on this. Let's kind of move below as we go through. So, I mean, when I think about some of the issues that this addresses, right, I think that expectations and solving around expectations, are we clear on what our shared results are, right? And not just having, to Sarah's point, a number, but is there a staff survey? I love the employee experience survey, because I think that, and there's arguments to and pro and con about using it as a goal per se, but how are staff feeling? Like, this is a bigger sense of picture, right? Of like what we're trying to get here. You're also thinking about making sure people know what to do, right? That's when the CEO can say, I can't possibly do all these results, or I need more for this, or I need a development person. But it really is about thinking about, alignment around goals, understanding where this fits in, really resetting expectations can go a really long way. And it's not always an easy route. Like, usually if expectations get blurry, it's like a little bit tricky, but I'm a big believer in at least annually just going through. It's almost like spring cleaning. If you kind of do it every year, like if I clean my curtains every year, they're never going to get disgusting and molded with dust. If I skip it for a few years, I'm really going to not be happy about it when I finally get around to it, when it becomes an emergency. So we're doing 4 separate case studies, which was probably ambitious. But I want to give you like some exposure, some different things that can help in terms of thinking about how to improve performance without even touching the issues. And I do think revisiting expectation is a huge one. So second one, and I'll read this out loud in case it's helpful. A school that has been traditionally high performing got rocked by the pandemic, as we all did. And as they were reemerging, they realized that their goal-oriented culture had eroded. They were very cognizant of how the talent landscape had shifted. People were kind of quitting left and right and mid-year, and things that maybe didn't used to happen as much. So they didn't want to do a full court press with like, we are accountable on goals, but they did want people to be more attuned to what their goals were, thinking about where they were at, thinking about the progress monitoring, and able to go from there. I think this page actually has a clearer explanation. So like aware of what their goals were, what each person owned, and how they contributed. And so they came to me and said, this is a problem. We used to be super goal focused. We're not anymore. We want to get back to it. We know it's a different world. So I want you to think about, what are the issues at play in this performance management ecosystem here that you're thinking about, or that this addresses. So I'll put 2 minutes on the timer again in the chat. Share your thoughts. What does this make you think about performance management? Hmm. We'll wrap up in just a few. Okay. So let's talk about this a little bit. Maybe some voices we haven't heard coming off mute and sharing your thoughts. What really came out to you? John, I'm going to call on you. I think you could elaborate on your comment. You've been spotted.
Dang. Hi, everyone. I'm John Sobrak. I'm with the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco. Yeah, I was just wondering with all that transition and new people and people that have been there and they're kind of scared maybe of, ruffling the ones that are there and afraid they're going to jump ship. But holding them accountable, but just listening more of like what they're needing or what might be lacking or how to hone in their focus. To me, it's the communication seemed lacking. Like it seemed like leadership was maybe too fearful to approach anything, but that's not a reason to back away from the accountability and making sure things are not being done or like the goal is blurred. So I think from the leadership, it needs to be a constant reestablishment of what the goals are, at the same time listening to what the staff is needing.
Mhm. Yeah,
Those
it's
are
an
my
and,
thoughts.
right? And I think too, I mean, and certainly folks out there in schools, a lot of the kind of standard metrics changed dramatically during COVID. What does attendance look like in a virtual school environment, right? High stakes testings were suspended. So I think for a while, they're like, well, we had all these goals and like nothing was happening like societally with them. Now we're coming back in. How do we kind of balance this and also listen to where folks are at now? How about another voice? Thank you so much, John.
I don't want to call Kira out, but I was just going to give voice to her comment. Kira, feel free to jump off if you want to. But I was really appreciating what she shared both about like the connection to the big picture. Like I think people, when you're setting goals, like really want to be seen and feel like they're contributing to whatever the like org has deemed as the most important like things. And you might need to drill that down a couple layers so that it feels meaningful in the day to day. And I liked what she wrote about goals are going to shift, whether it's a pandemic or another crisis, and how do you still account for making progress, even if you're not hitting the goal. I think one of the things we've tried to do in the past is like actually do like quarterly goal check-ins, because we know that things are going to shift and that can take some of the pressure out of setting like the right goals annually, because the world is moving so quickly. So I appreciated that. I don't know if anyone else
Hey.
wanted to add to it.
Sorry, I'm literally off camera because my back's bothering me. So I'm like,
Oh, you're fine.
so just couldn't reach the unmute button.
Oh.
But yeah, I was just thinking of like, I mean, Dana kind of lifted it up, the idea that the world around us can shift, and just recognizing that people are gonna or that understanding people might need that recognition for like the work they're doing, so they're not constantly afraid of like, oh, if I don't like get this exact number, then I failed. But like having kind of an agreement and a collaborative agreement between supervisors and supervisees around like what the goals they think or what the like work they should be doing to hit those goals. And then just the other thing that I think is important, like there's so many things that people do day to day that they might not understand how it actually connects to a really broader, important, loftier goal of the or mission of the organization. And it just, I feel like that for that will like kind of like more like what's the word I'm looking for? Like motivate or keep people really engaged in their work as like especially when things are tough.
I think too, and you can't assume, like sometimes people think very big picture and they understand how all these pieces work together and kind of like, you know, assuming is never a good idea in any way in leadership, right? That's like the old saying about assuming, but it is like, let's articulate like how A connects to B connects to C. And we all know D is our big goal, right? And I think that really helps people, you know, who are often coming to work and working hard anyway, to feel like I see a direct connection. I see this as I go through. This organization really, we ended up doing a lot of different stuff, including many of things that were mentioned here. But one thing that was really interesting, and this I think is helpful, is like they, you know, kind of reestablished their goals because it helped people, you know, they struggle a little bit with people who would feel like I'm never good enough. And so in some ways, setting goals is helpful. Like, here's what we're shooting for, and here's where this is. And if you want a stretch goal, we can put this, but it can kind of help quantify like good enough, which can feel sometimes like hard and elusive. And there's like lots of human things that kind of feed into those feelings and whatever that is. And then they also implemented, and you'll have this in the folder too, is they started doing a lot of informal feedback. And so I see a question that came through a little bit about, I think, a formal system. And so I'll get to some questions in a little bit. But one of the things that they found was, and I took this from an organization Dana and I used to work with, a lot of you would be familiar with, like a 2x2, right? Where like you sit down maybe quarterly or every 6 months with your manager, you say 2 things you do well, 2 things you could do better, 2 things your manager does well, 2 things your manager could do better. And then you just have a discussion. It's like pretty simple. It's a Google form. All the forms and templates are in there and how to do that. And those can go a long way to even just starting to just creating some of that informal feedback. We have like a target of where we're shooting for. I think the idea of like the clarity of goals is very kind to people. It helps them figure this out and just gives us a touch point along the way that's less high stakes and that can be more, it can also help acknowledge growth and good work, which people are sometimes give themselves short shrift on that. And so that ended up being one of the things that was really helpful in this whole ecosystem, was kind of easing into it in this way. And thinking about opportunities to kind of say, hey, here's what we're shooting for. How do you think you're doing? What could I do to help you? What's better here? So this also goes to like, there's a lot here. And I think that there's a lot about like the manager relationship and the good work piece. And I think there's also a lot about two-way feedback, which I'm not sure why that's not in here, but I think there's like a piece about giving feedback and having this. And I think that I'm a big fan of 2x2s because I think it's a great mechanism to get those conversations going. And it's pretty low stakes and easy to do in like kind of a bootleggy way. All right, another one. An organization was growing. And while there used to be just the number of people who could make decisions could sit around one table, that no longer became possible. So some of you might be feeling this from growing organizations. And as it grew, adult gossip persisted and many staff members got involved in it with who did this or who said what. And it wasn't mission based. It wasn't based on the work. It contributed to a difficult culture. So as we think about performance, right? If I'm the band leader and the band is, who said, he said, this said, right? It takes away from our ability to perform effectively. And so let's identify some of the issues that might kind of come into performance management with this. And so I will put 2 minutes on and let you light up the chat. It's so juicy. I appreciate everyone's engagement. Okay. All right. I see a lot of great thoughts in the chat. Would love to hear from some voices, maybe that we haven't heard yet, on what you see is happening here, or issues you would identify. And there's a lot, as there are in all of these, right? Because it's a complex ecosystem. Lots of contributing factors. I'm wondering if Sarah Tannenbaum can come off mute. Not to call you out, Sarah, and apologies for that. And I feel like I always get called off mute right after I took a giant bite of like a sandwich.
All good.
Could you add some thoughts and elaborate? I think your comment about the racy and communication and gossiping is really juicy.
Yeah. It's hard, right? When you grow from, a small upstart, where everybody, feels like they have a voice, to a larger organization where there's a reporting structure with managers and supervisors and directors and whatever other titles, people get in that process. And some of the people who there is still a table around which people are sitting and making decisions, but that is no longer everybody in the organization. And my observations about my organization is that some of the people who are not sitting around that table, if they're not informed, after decisions are made, they feel out of the loop, or they don't know that, these conversations are happening. So they express a sense of frustration that they're not being seen, or that issues aren't being dealt with, those sorts of things. And so the reporting back structure needs to be hardened, needs to be solidified, so that because I find that the people who feel like they're out of the loop are the people that are often whispering in the corners, and that as soon as they get the information that they need, which is not necessarily all the information that's shared around the table, that a lot of that gossiping goes by the wayside. We've had a lot of success in building racy matrices about who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, and who's informed on different projects. And we're still, we're in the middle of a project right now that is not going great because the racy matrix is not clear. But we have had a lot of success in employing those in our institution, and it ensures that goals get met and that everybody who's involved in whatever capacity has the information that they need.
Absolutely. I think those tools are great. I think Management Spender does a mocha. It is a huge piece of this. And I would add too, it's also about how do you make it, a lot of times in organizations, the people at the table might not have as much lived experience. They're not as proximate to the problem. And so how are you also increasing a culture of feedback? You can share your input. And sometimes that's through formal structures, like getting input on the front end. Sometimes it's through a culture of feedback, right? And kind of being able to say, here's what I think, or I actually disagree with the decision, or how do I do this? And so I do think that this often happens, and not just with growing organizations, frequently there, but anytime people change, right? It's just revisiting it helps to keep it fresh, keep it acknowledging, various factors that change, right? And it hits a lot of issues, especially around kind of being motivated, providing feedback, right? And really people really care and understand what's going on. So We'll do one more kind of quickly, and then I've got a few questions that we'll get to, but this one was interesting. So interest in an elite boarding school grew significantly during the pandemic, and the admissions team got swamped. Coming back to the office, an increased volume of work and changing societal attitudes about the role of work in our lives meant morale was low. The team was performing very well, so interesting in performance management, but not happy about it. So that's not a good sign. It's like the dun, 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 like how long can this last, right? So it's interesting because someone made a comment earlier about like, is this culture, is it performance management? And I think culture is made up of the millions of actions we all take every day in our organization. And so there's always a piece of this in how we are towards each other. If I don't feel successful at my job, it's hard for me to give it my all, right? And it's complicated, but I'll give folks 2 minutes here, and then would love for you to think about, this particular challenge and how does this kind of play into performance management. Mm-hmm. Okay. Great. I see a lot of great thoughts in the chat. I would love for somebody to come off mute and talk a little about what you're thinking about as it relates to performance management here. And this sounds like a juicy topic we could probably go very deep into. We'll try and just do the highlights.
I think that performance management is more than just, job performance that we need as HR professionals to be aware of, especially when overseeing a diverse group of associates. I think we need to take into account of being more proactive and active in the lives of their mental performance, and evaluating that on an equal basis. And I think a lot of organizations, we're so metric driven that we don't really take the time to really focus on, while they are performing well and they're doing their job because they need their bread and butter, how are they really feeling in terms of, the stressors that they're having to kind of battle to just appease to us, So I think that's what needs to be, the focus and concentration in this situation.
Absolutely. Thanks, Isaiah. Rachel, you have your hand up very fancily.
Yeah, I was thinking about the way in which, I think in both at work and in other spaces, I've noticed this a lot in disability justice conversations, there was actually really great learning during the pandemic, but in some ways, in some spaces it was well, it's over. We no longer need to do that. It was a temporary thing. And I think there are ways in which when people went back to work, whether that was literally went physically back to the office or went back to sort of a more normal way of life, if the ways in which we could have learned, and I think some orgs learned and some brought that in, we can learn from what worked, like what actually worked during the pandemic, of like having different, that like, you know, often workplaces were like, oh, there's like a lot going on for you, you can take time off, but like people's lives often have a lot going on. So like that kind of flexibility or mental health support, like actually is needed all the time. And so I wonder if like part of it was the sort of sometimes abrupt shift from one to the other without kind of integrating like what actually worked from a different kind of time.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, I'm remembering like, you know, in the very early days, I think there was a lot of like, oh my gosh, do what you need to do. You've got 3 kids, you know, whatever. And I think that has gone away. I think what was interesting in this organization is that the leadership still felt like, yes, if you review applications best from like 9 to 12 at night, God bless your ministry. And if you want to take the afternoon to like go play at the park with your kids, like that's fine. But I think that like in some ways that shift back, it felt like, but now it's in the office or other people are physically there. What does this mean? Or, you know, when will people, if I email at this time, what does that send a message as? And if my boss is emailing them, what does this mean? And so I think in a lot of ways, it was about a conversation about, hey, we care about you. We care about you as people. And they're in an interesting situation. I'm sure some people can relate. In some ways, their volume of work is based on the number of applications they get. And they can't predict that, right? They have indicators, they have places, but like at some level, like if an extra 1,000 applications come in on the due date, it's not like they can, you know, they've got like a 3-month window or whatever to turn it around. And so how do you deal with those levels? How do you think about, I think people brought up some good ideas about internal shifts or some balance, or, you know, share, and also like sharing best practices is like, you've got a team of people who essentially do the same thing. So there's a lot you can learn from each other. So this was really interesting. And one of the things that we ended up doing here was actually doing some like training about using your strengths. So I'm a Gallup strengths coach. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the strengths assessment. It's one of many. I love those. I'm like a big assessment geek, like the DISC, the Enneagram, whatever. But it's about like, you know, and I think what I love about it is like, there's no one right way to do a job, and we all have strengths that allow us to do this. And so if you're looking at the person next to you and they have a lot of executing strengths, they're going to zip through their list like this. You might be more strategic. You need time to think. That is equally valuable. And you bring an amazing variety of viewpoints to our mission with this as a team, but you don't need to compare yourself to them. You don't need to do it the same way as them. That's okay, right? And there might be some things you have to do the same way. Like, as we talked about earlier, like financial policies and procedures should exist consistently regardless of where your strengths are. But a lot of how we approach our work, how we're doing it, right? And we think about, what does that mean in terms of people's impact and how does that help them as they go through? And so let's see, I just got to shift my, you know, and I think we see that strengths training, like, you know, it leads to less turnover and attrition, which I think, you know, there's, you know, pieces of that. There's a sense of like being highly stressed when people feel like they're operating in their strengths. So it's always helpful to like go back to and kind of revisit. And especially if there's a break, you know, we're like we did at the beginning of the school year. So it was kind of not high season, hadn't picked up, but how do you think about this? So I want to get to I have a Q&A question, which is interesting, which was, and we can kind of talk about this scenario, which may apply here, which is, somebody said, our managers get high scores when it comes to setting expectations and direct management scores. However, performance review gets very low scores, right? And the managers and employees don't feel like the performance review process is connected to the goals, directions, and expectations. It's a one-time experience. You know, it's just not tied to what's going on kind of on the weekly and monthly level. And so it's, you know, and it's kind of saying like, so how do you help with this? And I think this is an interesting situation because it sounds like you've got kind of 2 pieces that feel disparate. One is the annual process and one is weekly and monthly. And ideally, like weekly would feel like monthly, would feel like yearly, and then you'd kind of like start it all over again. And it's hard when there's a disconnect. And so I think the first thing that I would say is like, you know, to what extent are they right? Like sometimes it helps to like dig around, look at some examples, think about this is what people perceive. The survey is telling me my whole organization perceives it's in that heat map tool. If your organization's big enough, is a very helpful way to start to understand if like that's the case in everywhere. Do some departments feel like it's more linked? What are those departments doing right? Right. Let me go study that department and see how they explain the performance review process, because there might be some things we could take to the other departments, but it might be across the board. And I think that, you know, like to me, it's always, the good news is in this situation, if I had to pick between which one people feel better about, I would pick the weekly and monthly routines over the annual one because it happens more frequently, right? And I think that there can be a world in which people say, hey, we actually need to bring these closer in line. This is working pretty well, but this needs to get better. And we need to kind of overhaul the annual process. It just is a big project. It's hard to do. It's time consuming. It can be like a big, you know, people will bring in others and see, but it's, you know, it's a harder ship to steer depending on how like it feeds up to the board and different pieces. And there's like a technical element. There's all kinds of pieces of it. So I do think that like when this happens, I think the first step always is like, what's the extent of the problem? Is it everywhere? What extent is there? Could this be solved with like labeling some sections of the review differently, or some talking points, or a staff meeting? Like, it doesn't necessarily need to like throw the baby out with the bathwater. There can be ways to kind of integrate it. But I would say kind of really looking and understanding that formal process. Sometimes people say like, oh, people aren't happy. Let's like dig in with the formal process first. And it's like, please don't. It takes so much time and energy. It's not worth the buck. It's a get to it later problem, which it sounds like you might be at if you feel like it's like the management, the direct reports are going well, but what does it mean to get to it later as well? Sarah, you have your hand up.
Sorry, you might address this. This is just a quick question, but we've tended to do yearly, but they take like almost a year to do. And then it feels like we just finished it and now we're starting it again and we're thinking about every 2 years. But one of the questions when we've kind of gone back to staff, we have about 97 staff. When we've gone back to staff, the question we always get back is like, what are these for? Are these related to bonuses, money, like, yeah. And so, you know, like, and it feels like, even though like I have my answer, it feels like the managers are having less and less confidence in the answer of like, these are check-ins, these are like making sure like, and then inevitably the question comes up is of the meeting expectations versus beyond expectations. So those are some of the things that my staff get really stuck on. And I was curious if you had any questions, any thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think one, it's super common. I mean, both from like the arduousness of it and, you know, it's like always and how much, but I do think that's actually another good place to go to, right? Like I just talked about like, what's the extent of the problem and try and figure this out first. And then I think it's like, what is the purpose? And I think what would be an interesting exercise is to like go to people in your building who are managers and like put some chart paper on the wall and say like, what do you think is the purpose of the performance review process? And like, you know, and let them go around their little markers and it's kind of anonymous and people can agree. You know, are people generally all in the same ballpark? Is there some disagreement? You know, or sometimes like a Google form or survey. And I always try and make them anonymous because I do think that helps. You know, I think similar to the leading edge survey, you could even say, we're going to do this survey in the meeting. So I know you're going to do it. Here's 10 minutes. You have the link, please fill it out. And then you get the feedback you need. You know, do you think it's a valuable process? Do you think it's a good use of time? You could, you know, you could say, here's what I do, right? Or like, I think our purposes are A, B, and C. To what extent do you agree on a scale of 1 to 10, right? And then you can say, let's come back and see. And I think in some ways, regrounding in that purpose, talking about some of the pros and cons, thinking about this piece, you know, I always tell people it's like, it sometimes seems like an extra step to be like, here's our point of view on something, but it actually really pays off in spades to say like, this is what we think it's for. A lot of places will, you know, I think there's often questions about raises and bonuses. And so it's helpful to spell out, does it connect or not? Right. And why, if not, why not? And, you know, I think there's like all pieces there, but I think that could be a helpful place to say, you know, I'm a big fan of kind of like going back to the people to learn more and to kind of figure out like, how would you define this? Where would this be? And sometimes you can then say, here's what our draft is. What do you think? What really helps it reach this purpose? What hurts it from reading this purchase? You know, what could we do to kind of balance these two pieces? Because it's helpful to measure. Like, I would never say for people to get rid of a process more formally, even if more formally is like a 2x2 in some ways. You know what I mean? That could be like, you could be a casual formal, but because it is helpful to take time to reflect, it's helpful to take time and say, where have I grown? It's helpful to take time and say, here's what I'm aiming for. And we want people to do this in an organizational way so that this is a place that they grow and thrive and are successful. And so we can reach our mission. So I don't know if that helps, but I think it is. And it's like a little bit, it's almost like talking like politics and religion. Like people always have strong opinions. It's like they come in all over and you're like, okay, I don't want to get in this conversation unless I'm like ready to have this conversation. And that's why I think there are a lot of these other tools that can actually really help people feel like better and perform better, like the resetting expectations, right? Like the 2x2s, like kind of a culture of feedback. And it starts to get at that metric of like, we're going to make beautiful music. We're going to really help our mission, but we don't have to do it through this like formal evaluation process. So I have let me see. Okay. I think we're good here. I have a tiny URL here that will lead you. And I also have a QR code. So I'll put the QR code up in a second if that's easier. And that has a 1-pager of all different resources and links and places. And so I hope that that's a really good resource for folks as they go through. I'll put the tiny URL in the chat. Actually, Dana, if you don't mind putting it in the chat, that would be really great. And I'm going to, in a second, go to the QR code, because I know sometimes we just zap, and who even knows how that magic works, but it happens. So I'm happy to, I think that, you know, in some ways it's always hard to think about a topic like performance management in an hour, right? And even though it's like, but I think that is like, hopefully this has got your brain thinking about all these kind of tiny ecosystem, like these parts of this ecosystem that can kind of be adjusted. And so you might not think about things like erasing your expectations, right? Being part of performance management, because we think of the formal process, but it helps people perform better. And so therefore it really helps kind of enhance performance management, right? And so this has been, I appreciate, you know, the clients who work through this and struggle, because I think it is a really hard part of being a leader. I've got some of my folks there. I think if it's helpful, you know, to talk, you can always email me here, right? And kind of see and talk about different examples. I think one of the benefits is, and why I love working with leading edge, you see a lot of different organizations. And the good news is you are not alone in your struggles. I always tell people you are, what do I say? You are not unique, because that means having problems no one else have. You're special and you have your own set of circumstances and your own dynamics and you're no particular person here, but you're not unique. People have these problems all over the place. It's part of the joys and the sorrows of leadership. And that's why we need you there leading the way, especially in the world that we're in. And I mean, I just feel like everywhere you look, it just is like, oh my gosh, like, I'm just going to go hide under my couch. Like, that seems like the best path forward for the next 20 years. And it's like, you know, we can, I think, get back, hopefully at some point someday, to a more peaceful world in all the ways. And I think that the work that your organizations do are so critical to it. And I'm just so grateful to you for that. So I think that's all I have officially. I'm happy to take questions, answer.
Yeah. Beth, it was so great to have you. And thank you so much, everyone, for jumping in so fully and engaging. It was great to hear from so many different voices. And there's such rich stuff in the chat too, which I'm saving so that I can go back and review it. And just a reminder, y'all, if you jump back up a little bit, there is a survey from us, because we have been using your feedback to continue to craft our ongoing after survey actions programs. And like I shared, we will send a follow-up email by tomorrow. So you will have access to this, and we'll include the links from Beth so you can make sure to access them. I already poked around and there's like the 2x2 templates in there and some other really juicy stuff that will hopefully be helpful. But thank you all for being here.
A lot of good books that I like. So super nerd alert, former reading teacher here. So, you know, good bedside reading.
Thank you guys.